Have you ever wondered who else was in the lion's den that night? Daniel wasn't alone. The Bible says God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. Tonight, we'll discover the invisible realm's intervention in the visible world, the real power of angels, and why some people emerge unharmed from even the most dangerous situations. Because sometimes forces far greater than what we can see are fighting on our behalf. As you settle in tonight, imagine descending into a stone-carved pit beneath the ancient city of Babylon, where the air is thick with the scent of wild beasts and the walls echo with low, rumbling growls. This is not a zoo or a circus. This is an execution chamber, designed specifically to provide the most terrifying death imaginable to those who dare defy the king's decree. Above you, torchlight flickers through iron grating, casting dancing shadows on limestone walls stained with the blood of previous victims. Below you, in the darkness, golden eyes peer through the gloom, the eyes of lions, the apex predators of the ancient world, kept hungry and fierce specifically for moments like this. But tonight, something unprecedented is about to happen in this place of death. Tonight, you're going to witness one of the most extraordinary demonstrations of divine protection ever recorded, a night when the natural order itself was suspended, when predators became protectors, and when an 80-year-old man proved that faith can literally move mountains and calm wild beasts. This isn't just the story of Daniel surviving a night with lions. This is the story of how unwavering integrity attracts divine intervention, how political schemes can backfire spectacularly, and how sometimes the very trap designed to destroy us becomes the stage for our greatest victory. More importantly, this is a story about the invisible realm, the dimension of spiritual reality that surrounds us constantly but rarely makes itself known in such dramatic fashion. Tonight, we'll explore what really happened in that den, who else was present besides Daniel and the lions, and why this ancient story contains truths that are more relevant today than ever before. Come with me into the depths of that stone pit, where we'll discover that sometimes our greatest protection comes not from avoiding dangerous situations, but from walking into them with unshakable faith in the God who controls even the hearts of kings and the instincts of wild beasts. To understand the miracle of Daniel's survival, we must first understand the extraordinary man who found himself in that den and the forces that conspired to put him there. Daniel's story doesn't begin with lions. It begins 60 years earlier with a teenage boy torn from his homeland and thrust into the most sophisticated pagan empire in the ancient world. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, he didn't just take territory, he took the best and brightest young men of Judah, intending to assimilate them into Babylonian culture and use their talents for his empire. Daniel was among these captives, selected not just for his intelligence but for his physical attractiveness and noble bearing. What Nebuchadnezzar didn't anticipate was that some captives would refuse to be assimilated. From his very first day in Babylon, Daniel made a choice that would define his entire life. He would serve his captors faithfully in every way that didn't compromise his loyalty to God. When offered the king's rich food and wine, Daniel politely declined, choosing instead a simple diet that wouldn't violate his religious convictions. This wasn't teenage rebellion. This was character formation under pressure. Daniel was establishing a pattern that would serve him for the next 8 decades. He would be the most valuable servant any king could want, but his ultimate allegiance belonged to God alone. For 60 years, Daniel served 4 different kings across 2 empires with such distinction that he rose to become one of the most powerful officials in the ancient world. He interpreted dreams that baffled the wisest men of his generation, provided counsel that saved kingdoms, and demonstrated administrative abilities that made him indispensable to every ruler he served. But with great success came great danger. Daniel's rapid promotion under the new Persian administration created jealousy among officials who had expected to inherit positions of power. These men faced a unique problem. Daniel was so competent and so honest that they couldn't find any legitimate grounds for accusation against him. Their solution was diabolically clever. Since they couldn't attack Daniel's performance, they would attack his devotion. They would use his greatest strength, his unwavering loyalty to God, as the weapon to destroy him. The trap they devised was a masterpiece of political manipulation, designed specifically to target the one thing they knew Daniel would never compromise: his daily prayer life. The conspiracy against Daniel reveals the sophisticated political maneuvering that characterizes power struggles in every age. Daniel's enemies understood that direct confrontation would fail. He was too valuable to the king, too competent in his duties, and too respected by the people. They needed a strategy that would force King Darius to destroy Daniel against his own wishes. Their plan was psychological manipulation on a grand scale. They approached Darius with a proposal that appealed to his ego while seeming to serve the kingdom's unity. Babylon had recently been conquered by the Persians, and the new administration faced the challenge of integrating diverse peoples with different gods, customs, and loyalties. King Darius, live forever, they said. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. The proposal seemed brilliant from a political standpoint. For 30 days, all prayer and worship would be directed exclusively to the king, demonstrating his supreme authority and forcing every citizen to acknowledge his divine status. It would unify the kingdom under Darius personally while identifying anyone whose loyalty was divided. What made the trap so effective was its apparent reasonableness. 30 days wasn't forever. Surely even the most religious person could suspend their prayers for such a short time, especially when the alternative was death. Any rational person would find a way to compromise, perhaps praying privately where no one could see, or simply waiting until the decree expired. But Daniel's enemies knew him better than that. They had observed him for decades and understood that his prayer life wasn't just a religious routine, it was the source of his strength, the foundation of his character, and the non-negotiable center of his existence. They knew he would rather die than abandon his practice of praying 3 times daily toward Jerusalem. Darius, flattered by the proposal and unaware of its true purpose, signed the decree into law. According to Persian legal tradition, once sealed with the royal signet, the law became irrevocable. Even the king himself couldn't change it. The conspirators had created the perfect trap. They had made faithfulness to God a capital crime while ensuring that even the king couldn't show mercy when the law was violated. When Daniel learned about the decree, he faced the most defining moment of his life. At 80 years old, he had already served his God faithfully through decades of political upheaval, cultural pressure, and personal trials. He could have reasoned that a lifetime of service had earned him the right to make one small compromise for the sake of survival. He could have prayed silently, or only in his heart, or waited until after the 30-day period. He could have traveled outside the city limits where the law might not apply, or found countless other ways to maintain his relationship with God while avoiding the letter of the law. Instead, Daniel did something that reveals the depth of his character. He went to his room, opened his windows toward Jerusalem, and prayed exactly as he had every day for the past 60 years. He didn't hide, didn't modify his routine, didn't even close the windows to make his prayers less obvious. This wasn't stubbornness or a death wish. This was the response of a man whose identity was so completely rooted in his relationship with God that compromising it would have been a form of spiritual suicide. Daniel understood that some things are more important than physical survival, and that integrity maintained is always more valuable than life preserved through compromise. The biblical account is spare in its details but profound in its implications. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. That phrase, just as he had done before, contains the key to understanding Daniel's character. This wasn't a dramatic gesture or a defiant stand. This was simply consistency. Daniel had been the same man in private that he was in public, the same man under pressure that he was in prosperity, the same man facing death that he had been living life. His enemies were watching, of course. They had timed their trap perfectly, positioning themselves to observe Daniel's response to the decree. When they saw him at his window, praying toward Jerusalem as they knew he would, they had their evidence. But they didn't realize they were about to witness something that would shake the foundations of their understanding about the nature of divine power. The moment Darius realized he had been manipulated was devastating. The man who had seemed so powerful, surrounded by advisors and protected by the might of the Persian Empire, suddenly discovered he was powerless to protect the one person he most wanted to save. When Daniel's accusers brought their evidence to the king, Darius immediately understood the trap he had walked into. This wasn't about law and order or royal authority. This was about destroying the most valuable man in his administration through his own decree. The biblical account reveals the king's emotional turmoil. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. For an entire day, the most powerful man in the Persian Empire exhausted every legal avenue, consulted every advisor, and explored every possible loophole that might allow him to spare Daniel's life. But the conspirators had planned too well. They returned to remind Darius of the fundamental principle of Persian law. Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. Darius found himself trapped by his own system, a prisoner of the very authority that was supposed to make him free. The irony was complete. The king who could command armies, build cities, and reshape nations couldn't save one old man who had served him faithfully. As sunset approached and legal options were exhausted, Darius faced the horrible reality that he would have to execute the very person whose wisdom and integrity had made his kingdom stronger and more prosperous. The law he had signed in a moment of vanity would now force him to commit an act he knew was fundamentally unjust. The king's final words to Daniel reveal his desperate hope that supernatural intervention might accomplish what human authority could not. May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. It was both a blessing and a prayer, spoken by a pagan king who was beginning to understand that Daniel served a power greater than any earthly throne. As Daniel was lowered into the den and the stone was rolled over the opening, sealed with the king's signet and the signets of his nobles, Darius retreated to his palace to spend the night in fasting and sleepless vigil. The most powerful man in the world had become powerless, while an 80-year-old prisoner was about to demonstrate the true meaning of power. What happened in the lion's den that night remains one of the most extraordinary supernatural interventions recorded in human history. But to understand its significance, we must look beyond the obvious miracle of Daniel's survival and examine the deeper spiritual realities that were at work. The Bible's account is both simple and profound. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. But this brief statement opens a window into the invisible realm that surrounds us constantly but rarely makes itself known so dramatically. First, consider the lions themselves. These weren't domesticated animals or circus performers. They were killing machines, kept deliberately hungry and fierce for the specific purpose of executing criminals. The Persian Empire used lions as instruments of justice because their ferocity was legendary and their effectiveness was guaranteed. No one survived a night in the lion's den. Yet something happened that defied every natural instinct these predators possess. Animals that should have seen Daniel as prey instead treated him as if he were invisible, or perhaps as if he were protected by a presence they could sense but not see. The lion's behavior suggests they were responding to something beyond human perception. Second, consider Daniel's state of mind during those dark hours. An 80-year-old man, alone in a pit with multiple lions, somehow maintained such peace that he was able to sleep. When morning came and the king called down to him, Daniel's voice was strong and clear, showing no signs of the terror or exhaustion that would have been natural under such circumstances. This wasn't mere courage or faith. This was supernatural peace that surpassed understanding, the kind of tranquility that can only come from the presence of divine protection. Daniel experienced what the psalmist wrote, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Third, and most importantly, Daniel wasn't alone in that den. His testimony makes this clear. My God sent his angel. The invisible realm had intersected with the visible world, and a heavenly messenger had taken up residence in that pit of death, transforming it into a place of protection. The angel's presence explains not just Daniel's survival but the complete transformation of the lion's nature. These predators became protectors, these instruments of death became guardians of life because the presence of God's messenger had changed the very spiritual atmosphere of that place. As dawn broke over Babylon, King Darius rushed to the lion's den with the desperate hope of a man who had spent the night in prayer to a God he barely understood. The stone was rolled away, and the king called down into the darkness with a voice trembling between hope and despair, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" The response that echoed up from the depths would change the course of the Persian Empire and demonstrate to the ancient world that the God of Israel was not just another tribal deity, but the sovereign ruler of heaven and earth. Daniel's voice was strong, clear, and filled with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent the night in the presence of angels. May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The implications of Daniel's survival hit Darius with overwhelming force. This wasn't just good fortune or animal psychology. This was direct intervention by the God whom Daniel served. The very miracle that Darius had hoped for but barely dared to believe had actually occurred. When Daniel was lifted from the den, not a scratch was found on him. The lions that should have torn him apart had not even damaged his clothing. The man who had been sentenced to the most horrible death imaginable emerged as if he had spent the night in a palace rather than a pit. But the story doesn't end with Daniel's vindication. It continues with divine justice being executed on those who had perverted human justice. Darius ordered that Daniel's accusers, along with their wives and children, be thrown into the same den. The biblical account notes grimly that, before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. This wasn't cruelty, this was demonstration. The same lions that had treated Daniel like a protected guest immediately reverted to their natural behavior when faced with ordinary human beings. The miracle of Daniel's survival couldn't be explained by tame lions or special circumstances, it could only be explained by supernatural intervention. The difference wasn't in the lions or the den or the circumstances. The difference was in the presence of God's angel, who who had been dispatched to protect a man whose character had proven worthy of divine intervention. Daniel's survival in the lion's den created consequences that rippled far beyond his personal vindication. King Darius, shaken by his encounter with the power of Israel's God, issued a decree that would be read throughout the Persian Empire, an empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing most of the known world. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves, he performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. This wasn't just political accommodation or diplomatic courtesy. This was genuine theological recognition by a pagan king that he had witnessed power beyond anything in his experience. Darius had ruled an empire, commanded armies, and witnessed the glory of human achievement at its peak, yet he had never seen anything like what happened in that lion's den. The decree meant that throughout the vast Persian Empire, from the palaces of nobility to the markets of common traders, people would hear about the God who could shut lions' mouths and protect his servants from certain death. The story of Daniel's survival would become part of the cultural consciousness of multiple nations and peoples. But the impact went deeper than imperial proclamations. Daniel's faithfulness under pressure had demonstrated to an entire generation of Jewish exiles that their God was not defeated, diminished, or distant. In a foreign land, surrounded by foreign gods and foreign customs, they had seen proof that the God of their fathers was still present, still powerful, and still faithful to those who remained faithful to him. For the Babylonian and Persian officials who witnessed these events, Daniel's character became a living demonstration of what genuine faith could produce in a human life. They had seen many religious people, many philosophers, many wise men, but they had never seen anyone whose private devotion so perfectly matched their public integrity, whose faith remained so consistent under pressure, whose God proved so reliable in crisis. Daniel's example influenced not just his contemporaries but generations to come. Young Jewish men throughout the empire would grow up hearing about the government official who chose death rather than compromise, and who discovered that God honors such choices with miraculous protection. While Daniel's survival is often taught as a story about prayer or faithfulness, its deeper significance lies in what it reveals about the invisible spiritual warfare that surrounds every human life. The lion's den was not just a physical trial, it was a battleground where the forces of heaven and hell contended for the soul of a nation. Daniel's enemies thought they were engaging in political maneuvering, but they were actually participating in a cosmic conflict that had been raging since the fall of Jerusalem. The question wasn't just whether Daniel would survive, it was whether the God of Israel would prove himself superior to the gods of Babylon and Persia. From hell's perspective, Daniel represented everything that threatened the spiritual darkness that had settled over the ancient world. He was a man whose life proved that it was possible to serve God faithfully even in the most corrupting environment, to maintain integrity even when surrounded by compromise, to choose principle over pragmatism even when the cost was death. If Daniel could be broken, if he could be forced to compromise or destroyed for his faithfulness, it would send a message to every believer in the empire that resistance was futile, that accommodation was inevitable, that God either couldn't or wouldn't protect those who remained loyal to him. But from heaven's perspective, this crisis was an opportunity to demonstrate divine power in a way that would strengthen faith throughout the known world. God allowed Daniel to be placed in the most hopeless situation imaginable so that his deliverance would be undeniably supernatural. The angel who shut the lions' mouths wasn't just protecting one elderly man, he was making a statement about the nature of divine authority that would echo through history. No earthly power, no matter how great, can ultimately prevail against God's purposes. No law, no matter how irrevocable, can override divine will. No threat, no matter how certain, can destroy those who are under heaven's protection. This understanding transforms how we read Daniel's story. It's not just about individual faithfulness being rewarded. It's about God using individual faithfulness as a weapon in the cosmic battle between light and darkness, truth and deception, heaven and hell. Daniel's experience in the lion's den speaks directly to challenges faced by believers in every generation, but perhaps especially to those living in our current cultural moment. While we may not face literal lions, we often confront situations where faithfulness to God puts us at odds with the dominant culture, where maintaining our convictions costs us opportunities, relationships, or security. Consider the parallels between Daniel's situation and modern challenges. He faced a law that made prayer illegal. We face social pressures that make biblical convictions unpopular. He was trapped by a system that seemed to offer no alternatives. We often feel caught between compromise and consequences. He had to choose between temporary safety and eternal integrity. We face similar choices regularly, though usually in less dramatic circumstances. Daniel's response provides a template for navigating these challenges. He didn't seek confrontation, but he didn't avoid it when it came to him. He didn't make his faith unnecessarily offensive, but he didn't hide it when expressing it carried a cost. He didn't look for martyrdom, but he didn't flee from it when faithfulness demanded he accept it. Most importantly, Daniel's experience teaches us that God's protection doesn't always prevent us from entering dangerous situations, sometimes it sustains us through them. The angel didn't keep Daniel out of the lion's den, he kept Daniel safe while he was in it. This distinction is crucial for modern believers who sometimes expect that faith should shield them from all difficulty rather than sustain them through inevitable trials. Daniel's story suggests that the highest expression of divine protection isn't the absence of danger but the presence of peace in the midst of danger. The lion's den also illustrates how God can use our moments of greatest vulnerability as opportunities for his greatest demonstrations of power. Daniel's vindication didn't just benefit him, it introduced an entire empire to the reality of Israel's God. Our faithfulness under pressure often has implications that extend far beyond our personal circumstances. As we examine Daniel's story from the perspective of eternity, we begin to understand that the lion's den served purposes far greater than simply preserving one man's life. This event became a testimony that would encourage believers for thousands of years, demonstrating that no earthly power can ultimately triumph over divine purposes. The timing of Daniel's trial was significant. It occurred near the end of the Babylonian exile, during the period when the Jewish people were beginning to hope for return to their homeland. Daniel's vindication served as a sign that God had not forgotten his promises, that he was still capable of delivering his people, and that he would fulfill his covenant commitments despite seemingly impossible circumstances. For modern readers, Daniel's experience provides assurance that our temporary trials serve eternal purposes. The 80-year-old man who spent one terrifying night with lions became an eternal symbol of faith's triumph over fear, of divine faithfulness over human schemes, of heaven's power over earthly authority. Daniel's survival also points forward to an even greater victory over death itself. Just as God sent his angel to shut the mouths of lions and preserve Daniel's life, he would later send his son to conquer death itself and provide eternal life for all who believe. The lion's den becomes a shadow of the empty tomb, a preview of resurrection power, a demonstration that God specializes in bringing life out of death. The story reminds us that our present sufferings, no matter how intense or frightening, are temporary and purposeful. They serve to reveal God's character, to strengthen our faith, to encourage other believers, and to demonstrate to a watching world that there is indeed a power greater than any earthly authority. Daniel went into that den as an 80-year-old government official facing execution for his religious convictions. He emerged as an eternal testimony to the faithfulness of God, whose story would be told around countless campfires, taught in innumerable schools, and preached from countless pulpits throughout history. As you rest tonight, remember that the same God who sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths is the God who watches over you today. The spiritual realm that became visible in Daniel's crisis surrounds you constantly, filled with the same divine messengers who are dispatched to protect, guide, and comfort those who belong to God. Daniel's experience teaches us that faith isn't the absence of fear, it's the presence of trust despite fear. It's not the guarantee that we'll avoid all danger, it's the assurance that we'll never face danger alone. It's not the promise that our lives will be easy, it's the certainty that our lives have meaning and that our faithfulness serves purposes beyond our understanding. The lions that were meant to devour Daniel became silent sentries standing guard over him. The den that was designed as a place of execution became a sanctuary of divine protection. The night that should have been his last became the dawn of his greatest testimony. This transformation from threat to protection, from death to life, from defeat to victory, is the signature of God's work in human lives. He specializes in reversing circumstances, in using our enemies' schemes against them, in bringing good out of evil and life out of death. When you face your own lion's den, whether it's a hostile work environment, a threatening medical diagnosis, a broken relationship, or any situation where your faith puts you at odds with the world around you, remember Daniel's experience. Remember that you're never alone in the den, that God's angels are always present even when they're invisible, and that what seems like certain defeat can become the stage for God's greatest demonstrations of power. The God who sent his angel to Daniel is the same God who promises never to leave you or forsake you. The power that shut lions' mouths is the same power that works in your life today. The faithfulness that preserved an 80-year-old exile is the same faithfulness that sustains you through every trial and challenge.